All right, here is Chapter 10. This is land, both public and private land. These will be the voiced over notes for Chapter 10. While I'm out, I should be back on Friday of this week. So let's get started. All right, the tragedy of the commons. This is something we've already talked about. We talked about this the first couple days of class, and I kind of showed you a video on this, which is located on my Moodle page if you want to go and recap what the tragedy of the commons is. In 1968, economist Garrett Hardin described the tragedy of the commons. This is the tendency of a shared limited resource to become depleted because people act from self-interest for short-term gain. Basically, they try and overuse a resource for short-term gain to where if they just limit it, if they didn't use it as much, they could use it for much longer and get more out of it. So our example here is the use of the commons is below the carrying capacity of the land and all users benefit. Remember, the carrying capacity is the limited amount that you can use before you've overextended yourself. So with our first little thing of sheep here, there's 3 of them there, and the grass is able to withstand how much they eat, and it's able to grow back. In the middle one, if 1 or more users increases use of the commons beyond its carrying capacity, so they're going beyond it, the commons become degraded. The cost of the degradation is incurred by all users. So if one guy overuses it, it hurts everybody. And then finally, unless environmental costs are accounted for and addressed in land use practices, eventually the land will be unable to support the activity. You've put too many on there, and now it's not going to be able to be used anymore as a grassland. Externalities. If you have taken economics, you will have talked about externalities by now. And I think most of you, since most of you are seniors, by this point might have taken economics. So let's talk about externalities. This is a cost or benefit of a good or service that is not included in the purchase price of the product or a service. In environmental science, we are concerned about negative externalities because of the environmental damage for which no one bears the cost. Thinking of something that's not in environmental terms, think if you moved next door to a baker. Well, a good externality would be that it smells good all the time because he's baking bread or whatever is being baked there would smell good. A negative externality would be the baker gets there really early in the morning and starts making noise, and that could wake you up. So that would be a negative externality. For us, for our externalities in the commons, since no one bears the cost for the commons, since it's just an open field, it's kind of hurting everyone because one person can ruin it for everybody. What could help this is privatization could help, but then you're taking it out of being public, and if it becomes somebody's private land, you might not be able to use it anymore. Another thing that would be even better is if they could have communication and trust amongst all the individuals, which is hard to say. Well, I guess it's easy to say, but really hard to do. Maximum sustainable yield. The maximum amount of a renewable resource that can be harvested without compromising the future availability of that resource. So here we have another of our S-curves that you studied in the last. So we had slow growth, then it goes up to fast growth, and then slow growth again. If you look at the little bullet point here, in theory, a population grows at its maximum rate when it is at approximately half its carrying capacity. So up at the top, we have that carrying capacity line. You don't ever want to go past that carrying capacity line because that's whenever you're going to be overextending and have negative externalities once you go past the carrying capacity. So you always want to stay underneath that. We do this in logging. We go past the carrying capacity and wipe out forests. We do this in fishing. I talked about the fishing in the Atlantic Ocean with the cod, and etc. There's so many different ways that we actually do this where we go past the carrying capacity. All right, here is a map basically of the protected areas in the world. We have international, national, and both to show you how much land around the world is being protected. Public lands. Public lands. This is part of your 9-week project, is it not? If you recognize all the names of these here. So I'm just going to read through these real quick. I'm not going to talk much about them because you're supposed to be looking these up for your 9-week project. So we have national parks. These are managed for scientific, educational, and recreational use, and sometimes for their beauty or unique landforms. Managed resource protected areas. These are managed for the sustained use of biological, mineral, and recreational resources. Habitat species management areas, actively managed to maintain biological communities. Strict nature reserves and wilderness areas established to protect species and ecosystems. Protected landscapes and seascapes. Non-destructive use of natural resources while allowing for tourism and recreation. And then national monuments, set aside to protect unique sites of special nature. Okay, so public lands, make sure you look these up and read this part in your book because it's part of your 9-week project too. All right, this is also some pictures from your book, but I'm going to spend a little time here and talk about the resource conservation ethic. People should maximize resources that are for the better good of everyone. But the thing is we mostly sell off our resources to different corporations, and then the corporations get to choose what they do with the resources. We have things known as multi-use land, which is land used for recreation, grazing, timber, harvesting, and mineral extraction. The funny thing is 95% of all federal lands are managed by 4 federal agencies: the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Bureau of Land Management deals with grazing, mining, timber, harvesting, and recreation. The U.S. Forest Service deals with timber harvesting, grazing, and recreation. The National Park Service deals with recreation and conservation. Well, Fish and Wildlife Services deal with wildlife conservation, and this is where you get your hunting and fishing licenses through also. All right, we have rangelands. These are dry, open grasslands that are primarily used for cattle grazing. As it sits, 55% of U.S. rangeland has poor soil from overgrazing. Back in 1934, we had what's called the Taylor Grazing Act. This was to stop overgrazing from the use of to go from common land to permit-based grazing to limit the number of grazing. These are very low cost to get, and they're very hard to manage because there's not enough people to actually monitor all the grasslands that are being grazed upon. The Bureau of Land Management does not use actual environmental scientists whenever they're trying to hand out permits. They use just lawmakers. Lawmakers are the ones who say how many permits there are. They don't actually ask environmental scientists how much grazing the land can actually take. All right, and then we have forests. These are areas dominated by trees and other woody vegetation. We're going to talk a little bit on the next slide about what forests are used for businesses. All right, here we have timber harvest practices. One is clear cutting, which is removing all or almost all the trees in an area. And this is the common practice used most all over the world, is they go into an area, they purchase an area of land, and they clear cut all of the trees off of the land. Well, one of the things that happens when you clear cut the trees, you basically have interrupted the flow of water. Instead of the water being stopped as it comes down and the trees and the grasslands being using the water, it causes mudslides because the water is just carrying more and more mud down and it seeps in that way, and it hurts biodiversity. The other one is selective cutting. This is removing single trees or relatively small numbers of trees from a forest. It would be if these companies are wanting the long term, they could selectively cut down some of the trees and then plant others after they've cut those down, and let them grow back to where they're not hurting the ecosystem as much, and they're not hurting the biodiversity of the area, and they're not causing as many mudslides. It has less of an impact. Here is some pictures of if you do clear cutting at the top, the regrowth is going to be very small. The next one is if you do the selective cutting, if you cut just a few of them down and then you plant other trees, you're going to have different ages of tree in there. And so whenever you come back to cut again, you know exactly which trees. The bigger ones are going to be the ones you cut down. Another type that you might see is called a tree plantation. These are people or corporations that grow trees just to have them cut down again. They use fast-growing trees. A tree plantation is a large area typically planted with a single rapid-growing tree. The problem with this is by cutting them down and planting again, you're basically degrading the soil this way, and you're going to have to use fertilizers to make sure you keep all the nutrients in the soil. All right, fire management. These are prescribed burns. This is a fire is deliberately set under controlled conditions. In general, we always think of fires as something we need to put out, but in a lot of cases, the environment really likes a fire because it lets an area, by burning the trees and the grasslands and the bushes and everything, actually puts a lot of nutrients back into the soil, and the forest or the grassland or whatever bounces back very quickly from this because it's actually regaining a lot of the nutrients. We try to suppress fires, but fires are needed to get rid of dead underbrush. This causes very large fires if you don't get rid of the underbrush. So in 1988, Yellowstone had a fire. A third of Yellowstone was burned. It helped the soil. Now, whenever you go to Yellowstone, and this happened just back in 1988, if you go to Yellowstone now, you would never know that there was a fire, although that they've kept an area so that you can see what happened there. If you ever get to Yellowstone, they have a whole section where they talk about the 1988 burn, and they show you the area that got burned in the park. All right, forests now with, let's first talk about the national park forests. These are established to preserve scenic views and unusual landforms. They are multi-use, but maintain them as they were first discovered. Now we use environmental science to help the parks. Next, we have national wildlife refuges, managed for the purpose of protecting wildlife. They protect the wildlife and they limit the human activity that goes in there. Basically, you have to get in through ATVs and stuff, and they don't build a lot of roads back into these. Then we have national wilderness areas, set aside to preserve large tracts of intact ecosystems or landscapes. They build no roads into here, and there's no hunting and there's no mining. So all the resources that are there stay there. There's 38.5 million hectares in the United States, with 60% of this being in Alaska. The largest one we have there's a huge chunk of Alaska that is a national wilderness area, and it has been under protection to where there is no mining, because they've also found a large oil deposit under this, and they're not letting them get to this. So there's a lot of resources up there that are being protected by the government. Federal regulations. The National Environmental Policy Act, the NEPA, mandates an environmental assessment of all projects involving federal money or permits. If you use any money from the federal government, you have to have one of these mandates put in, and so somebody's got to come in and look at the environmental impact of whatever it is you're doing. Environmental impact statement outlines the scope and purpose of the project. So if you're using federal money, this is what you got to get, one of these EISs. So environmental mitigation plan outlines how the developer will address concerns raised in the project's impact on the environment. So once the study is done, whoever's going to build or do whatever with the federal money needs to have a way to mitigate whatever damage is happening to the environment. All right, now residential land. Suburban areas surrounding metropolitan centers with low population densities. We are becoming a more suburban environment and people. We move further and further out from cities. I'm going to show you a graph in just a second to show you over time how the migration of people has happened. Exurban. Similar to suburban areas, but are not connected to any central city or densely populated area. These are going to be little towns that aren't connected. We've got the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where Dallas and Fort Worth are our two huge hubs. But then as you move further out, we have little cities that are basically what we call our suburb cities. So once you move out from Dallas, and you'll move further north, and you'll get to Richardson, and you'll get to Plano, and then you'll get up to Allen and McKinney. So you have the suburban development, and it's growing further and further out as you go from a big city, where the exurban is going to be your little towns. As you go further and further out, there's going to be more land between each little population point. Here's the graph that shows you starting back in 1950 going to the year 2000. And if you see how it goes, back in the 50s, most of the people the population was in a rural setting, where as you follow that now, rural is one of our lowest ones, where urban has stayed gradually growing in the middle the whole time, where our suburbs have gone way up. And they were a very small part back in the 1950s, to where in just 50 years, a majority live now in the suburbs. Urban sprawl. And on the AP test, they do like to talk about urban sprawl. This is the creation of urbanized areas that spread into rural areas. So if you think about Frisco, Frisco used to be a little dot on the map in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We can actually say the same thing for Flower Mound and the Highland Village. We used to be a little dot on the map, but actually you could consider us kind of a rural area. Now, if you go to Frisco or Flower Mound and stuff, we are basically a suburb of the Dallas-Fort Worth area now because it's grown into this. And this is what urban sprawl does. It sprawls into rural areas. There are 4 main concerns of urban sprawl in the U.S. One is automobiles and highway construction. Because people are moving further and further out from the city, from where they work, we're having to build more and more highways and have more construction. If there's more highways, we're going to be building more fossil fuels because people are going to be driving more. And especially around here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, our mass transit is not very good. If you go to New York or Chicago or San Francisco, or there's many other big towns in the United States, they have great mass transit systems to use. Around here, our mass transit is not very much. Living costs. People can get more land and a larger house in the suburbs for the same amount of money. It is cheaper. The further out you go from the town, the cheaper the land is. So the cheaper the land is, the more you get for your money. Living costs are cheaper. So the further out you go, the cheaper it is to live. Already in Texas, Texas is already one of the cheapest places to live in the United States because we have no state income tax. So the further out you go, we have people that move into here from out of state, and they have tons and tons of money because they sold their houses that were so expensive. Now they have this money that goes a lot further in Texas, and so they're moving further out with their money and buying more land. We have something called urban blight. This is city revenue shrinks as people move to the suburbs. As people leave the city has less money, so that's less money for the police, the hospitals, transportation costs remain the same. So as the people leave, it tends to weaken the city, the actual, like I'm talking about like the main city, like Dallas and Fort Worth. Because what happened to this, it leads to racial segregation. In the 50s and 60s, whenever people started to leave in urban sprawl, the Caucasians left first, and they called it white flight at the time. And most of the minorities were left in the cities, which in the suburbs at that time had mostly a white population. And you can look at sitcoms that were made back in the 60s and 70s, and it'll be totally white families and totally white neighborhoods. And then you get the onset of the Jeffersons and things like that moving in with TV shows, and you'll see how the urban sprawl takes place. And there's a lot of TV shows that actually take this into account when they talk about it. The last one is government policy. The Highway Trust Fund, the Highway Review Act of 1956, the gas tax is to pay for road maintenance. So all that, whenever you buy gas, one of the taxes on gas is basically to pay for the roads. Here we have a couple of the feed let-back loops. If you look at the top one, it says the customer, they leave. If they leave, then the neighborhood declines. Once the neighborhood declines, the population shifts to the suburbs. Well, if it shifts to the suburbs, then the tax revenues decline. If the tax revenues decline, then the services are going to get cut. If the services get cut, then people leave. So here's one of the feedback loops. Another one we have, I'll start on the right. Increased tax, where do I want to start? The suburbs expand. In doing so, as they expand, you're going to have more traffic driving in, increased traffic congestion. More traffic congestion gives you longer commutes. Longer commutes mean you're using more gas. Using more gas increases the gas tax revenue. If I have more tax revenue, then I can build more highways. If I have more highways, then people are going to move more out into the suburbs. And there's another feedback loop. All right, the Highway Trust Fund. This is a federal gasoline tax to pay for construction and maintenance of roads and highways. So more, and then zoning. A planning tool to create quieter and safer communities, for example, prohibiting the development of a factory or strip mall in residential areas. You'll see around here, we have areas that are zoned for residential. We have areas that are zoned for business. You'll have small business. You'll have multi-family units. This is where you get apartments and things like that. There's all kinds of different zoning. Multi-use zones allows retail and high-density residential development to coexist in the same area. If you look at the new area that we've just built down off of 2499, right at the border between it and Grapevine, where we have the movie theater and all the new little businesses there, and we have apartments and things like that built on top of them. This is multi-use zoning because it's going to have businesses and residential together. Subsidized mortgages. These are low interest rates offered to people to purchase a home that would otherwise not be able to do so. We have several things that work with this. We have the Federal Housing Administration in the 30s. They federally subsidized mortgages at low interest loans. We also now have the GI Bill that helps veterans and things like that. People like that get low interest loans to buy houses. All right, smart growth. How could a city be smarter in the way that it develops and grows? Mixed land uses. All those zones that we just talked about, that you mix those up and you have them spread out all over the place, helps for people to have smart growth. Create a range of housing opportunities and choices. Don't all build just one type of housing. Have all different ranges of housing, from low income to the multi-million-dollar homes. Create walkable neighborhoods. Your houses should not be right next to each other. Like most of the time we build houses right next to one another. You should have basically paths and things to walk through your neighborhood, and it lets people walk around and meet your neighbors more also. Encourage community and stakeholder collaboration in developing decisions. That's kind of what HOAs are supposed to do that we have now, but they a lot of times seem to get steamrolled just by the board members that are on there. But it's probably trying to get people's input on how they should develop their towns. And that's why you should have town halls and things and talk about how you want to develop your town. Take advantage of compact building designs. You don't have to have giant buildings all the time. You can have smaller. At a lot of downtown areas, if you look at downtown Louisville and how they have the smaller downtown area and the smaller buildings and things like that, that used to be the norm back in the 50s and 60s. You have the town squares. If you go to a lot of the smaller towns around Texas, you'll see a town square where they use smaller buildings, and there's a lot of them around one central area where everybody could come and do all their shopping. Foster distinctive, attractive communities with a strong sense of place. This is another getting to know your neighbors and getting to know everyone and do things with everyone and have social events that actually encourage everyone to show up and meet each other. Preserve open space, farmland, beauty, and critical environment areas. So basically preserving what's still around there. And provide a variety of transportation choices. This is what we don't do very well at all. Having a multitude of transportation choices. It's hard to walk somewhere. It's hard to bike somewhere. At times, it's even hard to drive somewhere around here, and we don't have mass transit in this area at all. But having all those choices actually makes for smarter growth. And a 2000 study found that a smart growth plan in New Jersey that was put into effect reduced the water pollution by 40%. And that was in 2000. In 1999, the EPA found reduced fossil fuel use by 58% with public transportation. Think about that. 58% fossil fuel use was cut because of the opening of public transportation. So we could cut back on a lot if we had decent public transportation. And in a 2005 study in Seattle found that 26% fewer miles traveled because of increased bike and walk travels to markets and doctor's offices. If we had better bike paths through the city of Flower Mound or through any city, it'd be easier to get on your bike or something or even walk or jog to the places in the city than to drive your car everywhere. And these last couple of slides are just some pictures of different areas showing smart growth. Hey, some mass transit that people can use. Would be great to have that around here. And some housing where you can get lots of people in areas to live in certain areas to where you have different levels of housing. This could be one branch of housing. This is about middle income. And that's it for the notes. Good luck on your quiz.